Hello and welcome to this whiskey tasting session. It's very good to see you again. So for this whiskey tasting session, we will be featuring 5 Scotch and Irish whiskies. So we invite you to try the following: Buskers single grain, Dewars French cask, Dewars Japanese cask, Johnnie Walker Black Label, as well as McConnells standard Irish whiskey. So, just like all of the previous whiskey tasting sessions we have invited you to, you are more than welcome to try the whiskies or pass on them and try them exactly as you please. You have been provided with ice, whiskey stones, a variety of different styles of glasses, and the standard one that we have applied each of the drinks to is the Glencairn. I will be sharing in your whiskey tasting session today with a Glencairn of my own. I tend to prefer my whiskies straight, not on the rocks, just as they come. You are more than welcome to try them exactly as you please. So, are you nice and comfortable? Perfect. So, the first drink that you have in front of you is Dewars Japanese Smooth. So, as you can see, the Dewars Japanese Smooth and the French Cask look very similar to one another, and that is because this is part of a range from Dewars. It is a tribute to other spirits and other styles of spirit preparation from around the world. Dewars has Japanese cask, they have French cask, Caribbean cask, they have Portuguese, as well as illegal. So, whilst you explore that particular whiskey, I'll tell you some of the history of Dewars whiskey, just because it is a new brand that we have sampled into our whiskey tasting sessions. Okay, so Dewars is a blended Scotch whiskey owned by Bacardi. They are the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in the world, with over 1,000 medals earned in international competitions. The brand was created in 1846 by John Dewar Sr. His sons, John and Tommy, went on to control the business, and by 1896 were gaining awards for their whiskey. In 1925, Dewars joined the Distillers Company, a once leading Scottish drinks and pharmaceutical company, which became acquired by Guinness in 1986, which eventually went on to become a piece of the major brand Diageo, who then sold Dewars to Bacardi. Dewars began their success in America with one small keg of Scotch. It was requested by Andrew Carnegie as a gift to President James Garfield. Andrew went on to gift the same whiskey 8 years later to President Benjamin Harrison for his inauguration. Notably, in 1897, numerous cases of still perfect Dewars Scotch were recovered by an underwater archaeologist from the shipwreck of SS Regina, which sank in Lake Huron in 1913. Dewars is distilled at one of 5 Dewars-owned distilleries: the Aberfield Distillery in Highland, Perthshire, Scotland, built in 1898. So it has a very beautiful and rich history, and that's just a small part of it. So the first one we're going to have a look at is the Japanese Smooth. The Japanese Smooth is a tribute to Japanese, or specifically Mizunara style whiskey. And Mizunara whiskey typically has a little bit more of a smoky sensation to it, so I invite you to explore this one. Even if you only smell this one, it's fascinating just for that alone. So this one is 40% alcohol by volume, and it has just the most beautiful light gold colour to it. So Japanese Smooth is an 8-year-old blended Scotch whiskey finished in Mizunara oak casks, and it is the 4th release in the Cask series, the 5th I believe being the Portuguese. This was released in July 2021, and expect this one to be full-bodied but smooth. It's very much an approachable whiskey for that reason, and it's a really good introduction to Mizunara oak. So, have you ever sampled Dewars? Okay, and have you ever sampled Japanese whiskey of any kind? Okay. So this one, as mentioned, has a beautiful light gold colour to it. It's just stunning for that reason. The nose is soft, fruity, beautiful honey notes, sweetness and hints of citrus. And what do you think? It's certainly a unique experience through the nose on that one. It's rich and robust, certainly full-bodied even in the presence of the nose. Now just wait until you taste it. It's certainly approachable, but very full-bodied. Gentle notes of peach swirl throughout on this one. There is mandarin oranges. There are notes of spicy sandalwood and cinnamon throughout on this one. It's delicious, isn't it? Now, the finish on this one, let's go back for another sample of this one. Is smooth, very smooth. Sweet, smoky finish, and that smokiness is coming more so from the Mizunara oak rather than the whiskey itself. What begins fruity and honey based seems to be finishing a little bit more mellow and maltier. It has a wonderful mouthfeel to it, and it is so lovely and simple and layered throughout the tasting experience. So, what did you happen to think of this one? Very interesting. Just put this one to the side, grab the next one. So now we're going to move on to Dewars French Cask. So that is this particular glass for you. So this one is also a 40% alcohol by volume whiskey. This one is finished in apple spirit Calvados casks. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about this one. So the French cask is the 5th edition in the Cask series. Pardon me for the Portuguese fact on that one. It has a full-bodied blend of apple and citrus notes. The whiskey uses Dewars 8-year-old blended Scotch whiskey finished in apple brandy casks of French Calvados. So let's explore this one. So this one has more of a deep honey colour as opposed to the light gold on this one. This has a little bit more of a interesting hue to it. Now, the smell of this one, initially sweet and grainy. Slight notes of ethanol throughout. Fresh, fruity apple notes, and when you swirl the whiskey around, as we've seen before, the benefits of the Glencairn are that those notes come up and invite themselves a little bit more clearly. Beautiful, fresh and fruity apple notes throughout on this one. So let's give this one a go. Now this one in comparison is more light-bodied. It has peaty ash notes and it's smoky. There are wonderful notes of apple cinnamon throughout this one, however. Brown sugar and maple blend so beautifully with that base of Dewars whiskey. Now the Dewars whiskey has a more predominant profile of vanilla and butterscotch, so this fusion of the brown sugar maple almost makes for a beautiful, sweet, almost on the verge of a dessert style whiskey. Very appetizing. However, the flavours of this one are not so upfront. It's very warm and smoky and complex, very well layered. The Calvados makes the whiskey sweeter overall and creates such wonderful dimensions to the whiskey. So I'm going to sample once more and we'll explore a little bit of the finish of this one. So this has a short finish and it's not complex. The flavour profiles don't really change throughout the tasting experience, and the scent profile is rather similar to the tasting profile on this one. So it's very much a what you smell is what you get sort of whiskey. And I will say, for being a 40% alcohol by volume whiskey, it packs a lot of heat, and it can certainly compete with those that have a little bit more alcohol by volume. Very impressive for that reason. Those peaty notes that come out are certainly nothing like Lafroig, but we're not looking at Lafroig. This has its own character and its own representation of beautiful peatiness. So I'd say that this one, as well as the Japanese whiskey, are extremely approachable and very inviting. These whiskies are rather beneficial to people who want to try new spirits, try new drinks, or even try new versions of different whiskies. And at their price point, it invites you to try them in a very new and exploratory way. So I'm curious to know what you think of that one. Okay. And how did you think it compared to the Japanese cask? Do you have a preference at all? Interesting. So moving on, we now have an Irish whiskey for you to try. This is from a slightly newer brand called Buskers. Now, this particular whiskey that we have from them is 44.3% alcohol by volume, so it's a little bit stronger than the other two whiskies you've sampled today. So, Buskers first released their products in 2020, and they are owned by Di Serrano. Buskers' standout product is their blended whiskey, but they also sell single grain, single malt and single pot still. The one that you will be sampling today is the single grain. It is distilled in Royal Oak Distillery located in County Carlow, Ireland, and many of the distillery's ingredients are sourced from the surrounding area. The single grain whiskey uses ex-bourbon and ex-marsala casks during the maturation process, and this whiskey is non-chill filtered. So this one has a little bit more of a modern feel to it, and that is what the Busker brand is trying to achieve. It's trying to modernize the whiskey selections on the shelf. Now, there isn't really a personal history to this whiskey. We couldn't find anything regarding a family or a specific person. It just seems to have cropped up out of nowhere, and we would love to find out more information on Buskers so that we can share it with our customers. So let's jump right into this one. The colour of this one is just a flat out honey colour, and if you want to, you can now feel free to smell this one. This one has a coppery smell to it, slightly metallic. Green apples. And when you swirl the whiskey around a little more, it has cereal sweetness, cocoa, honey, and a very lightly spiced cinnamon. And when you let this whiskey sit after swirling it, those aromas come up nicely, rise nice and gently. It's not much of a burn to this one, it's very elegant. What do you think? Okay, so I invite you now to try this one. You may feel free to try it or pass. Okay. So this one has a very interesting flavour profile that changes slightly throughout the tasting experience from beginning to end. Initially, I get impressions of dried bananas, earthy, slight touches of coconut throughout. It's a light-bodied whiskey, watery but sharp. Now when this one settles into your teeth and tongue, there's no burn to it. It just changes ever so slightly from a more earthy and fruity based to slightly more spicy at the end. But very, very slightly. The finish of this one is short. It does have a lot of those fruity notes that flow throughout. Instead of dried bananas this time, it appears to be focusing a little bit more on dried apples right at the end there. Now, that dried apple flavour continues into a very subtle ending of almost dessert-like sweetness. This is a very interesting whiskey, and for being 44.3%, it doesn't have much of a burn to it at all. It goes down nice and smooth. The flavours are very approachable. That's what helps it distinguish itself from other whiskies on the shelf next to it. So what do you think of this one? Interesting. Okay. So let's move on. So now we're moving on to McConnells whiskey. This is an Irish whiskey with a fascinating history to it, and I would be more than happy to share that history with you today. So this next one is McConnells. This one's that one right there, and that will be that glass for you. So this is a 42% alcohol by volume Irish whiskey, a little bit weaker than the Buskers, a little bit stronger than the Dewars. So the story of McConnells begins in 1776 in Belfast. The McConnells family began selling their whiskey to the public. Note that the word whiskey on the bottle here doesn't feature an E, despite it being an Irish whiskey, which almost always features an E. This was because the McConnells were already a well-established brand long before the name change in the 1900s. So they kept the original spelling for that reason. They eventually opened their own distillery on the banks of the River Lagan to keep up with the demand at the time. Unfortunately, as many distilleries did, this one burned down in 1909, along with 500,000 gallons of whiskey. Despite the McConnells rebuilding the distillery to the best of their efforts, they faced another large problem, and that was the American Prohibition, which wiped out 90% of Irish whiskey companies, McConnells unfortunately included. And as you have been here for our previous tasting sessions, you'll know that there were just a few survivors of the American Prohibition in the whiskey company department. After 90 years of silence from the brand, they re-emerged to the Irish whiskey market to create their drinks once more. They are currently owned by Belfast Distillery Company, who have invested just shy of $27 million into creating a new distillery for McConnells in Belfast. So, quite the interesting story. I do love when a whiskey has a long, interesting and family-based history to it. So, this one, as mentioned, is 42% alcohol by volume. Certainly not the strongest whiskey we have invited you to try, but packs a punch, nevertheless. So this one is aged for 5 years and uses a mix of malted barley and grain whiskey to mimic the original recipe. They use ex-bourbon barrels, which adds a subtle sweetness to the whiskey, paired with woodiness. So let's have a look at this one. So the colour on this one is warm honey. It's beautiful, almost light-bodied in its appearance. Now, the nose on this one has light citrus notes, cedar, sweet spice, peppery oak, and some vanilla undertones, but I would be rather curious to find out what you think of the scent of this one. Okay, so now I invite you to try this one. You may pass on it, of course, if you please, and you may sample it however you like. Okay. So initially, you get spicy white pepper and earthy vanilla pod and fruit, molasses, and slight citrus, ever so slight, not quite as strong as it was smelling it, but it is there. Now, to end for this one, it focuses a little bit more on a sweeter, richer side. Butterscotch follows into dark treacle, toasted spices, oak, and some lingering ripe fruits right in the crevices of your tongue and teeth on this one. This one does have a little bit of heat on it, certainly feels a little bit warmer than the Dewars and the Buskers, but not in an inoffensive way. It's rather inviting and still appealing, I would say. So, what do you think of this particular one? Interesting. Very good. So now we're going to be moving on to the fifth and final whiskey for today's whiskey tasting session. So now we are moving on to Johnnie Walker Black Label. Despite it being our 7th whiskey tasting session that we have hosted for our customers, it is a surprise that we have not yet featured Johnnie Walker. However, I'm more than happy to invite you to try it today. So I have quite a bit of history on Johnnie Walker, if you'd like to hear about it. Of course. So Johnnie Walker is a Scotch whisky currently owned by Diageo. The brand was first established by grocer John Walker in the Scottish burgh of East Ayrshire. It is the most widely distributed blended Scotch whisky in the world, and as of 2016, the brand sells 223 million bottles a year. However, I would believe that that figure has gone up since then. The Excise Act of 1823 relaxed strict laws on distillation of whisky and reduced by a considerable amount the extremely heavy taxes on the distillation and sale of whisky. John Walker himself was not a drinker, and by 1825 he was selling spirits, rum, brandy, gin, and whisky. At this point, blending grain whiskies and malt whiskies was still banned, so John Walker opted to sell both blended malt whiskies and grain whiskies. They were sold as made-to-order whiskies blended to meet specific customer requirements, because he did not have any brand of his own. He began branding his whisky as his own a few years later, naming it Walker's Kilmarnock Whisky. John Walker passed away in 1857. The height of Johnnie Walker's success came after his death because of the successful management of his son and grandson, Alexander Walker and Alexander Walker II. The Spirits Act of 1860 legalised the blending of grain and malt whiskies, and this began the modern era of blending Scotch whisky. Blending Scotch whiskies tends to create a lighter and sweeter in character whisky. This tends to also be slightly more accessible to their audience, flavour-wise. The Walker family were not the first, however, to produce a blended Scotch. That title goes to Andrew Usher of Edinburgh. The signature square bottle, as you can see right here, was first introduced in 1860. It was created this way so that more bottles could fit in one space, and it would reduce the possibility of the bottles smashing. Another notable feature of the bottle is the label, which was featured first in 1860. The label is applied at an angle of 24 degrees upwards left to right and allows the text to be larger and more visible. This helps consumers to identify the bottle from a distance. Another feature that helped Walker's success was the building of a railway in Kilmarnock, carrying goods to merchant ships travelling the world. Because of the successful management tied with this new ability to sell bottles to a larger audience, Walker went on to sell 100,000 gallons a year by just 1862. Alec created Johnnie Walker's first commercial blend in 1865, which was Old Highland whiskey, and registered it in 1867. As John Walker sold many goods, whiskey accounted for just 8% of his income. However, under the ownership of his son and grandson, whiskey made up 90 to 95% of their income. In 1893, the Walkers purchased the Cardew distillery, and this helped reinforce their stocks of one of their blends. By 1906 to 1909, Walker had 3 major whiskies on the market: Old Highland at 5 years old, Special Old Highland at 9 years old, and Extra Special Old Highland at 12 years old. But because their labels were white, red, and black, they were more commonly called by the colours rather than by their official names. Now, you've probably heard of Johnnie Walker Red, Blue, Green, Black, Gold, and many colours. However, you've probably not heard, at least in recent years, of Johnnie Walker White, and the reason for that is they dropped it from their range in World War I. In 1997, Diageo made the purchase of Johnnie Walker, and by 2012 closed all operations at Walker's home of Kilmarnock. Despite there being many petitions and public campaigns from locals, they did proceed to close it down, and by 2013 they had demolished the buildings. However, to hold on to the roots of the brand, Diageo has kept the bottling process in Kilmarnock. Johnnie Walker is now produced in Diageo's bottling facilities at Leven in Fife and Shield Hall in Glasgow. So that's quite the history, and that's just a small part of it. They have quite the history. And if we feature Johnnie Walker in the future, I'd be more than happy to share a little bit more history on them. So let's have a look at this one. So this one will be the final glass, right there for you. So, Johnnie Walker Black Label is aged for 12 years as opposed to red, which has a no age statement, and green, which has a 15-year aging process. This particular whiskey is a blend of single malt and grain whiskies from across Scotland. Now, this specific whiskey is 40% alcohol by volume. So the nose on this one has very bold scents of fruits and a touch of vanilla. There are dried strawberries and some slight earthy notes. And there is a slight waft of peat on this one. So my first initial impression of this one is creamy toffee. The body of this one is very smooth and velvety and sweet, not in an overbearing way, but very gentle and palatable. It has sweet fruit and spice rolling over the tongue. And this one has beautiful layering to it as it transitions from one flavour to another. It does it in such a gentle and complementary way. This one is very accessible, very inoffensive, and it has a rather low burn. Now that is to be expected from a 40% whiskey, but this one is particularly smooth and it particularly lacks that burn. It goes down nice and gently. Instead of focusing on notes of ethanol or burning sensations, you're getting all of that warmth instead of a burn, and that's what you hope for with a good whiskey, is warmth, not a burn. Because with warmth you allow yourself to taste all of those beautiful, robust, delicate flavours. So when you have that level of quality applied to the whiskey, as well as drinking it from something like a Glencairn glass or other forms of assistance to the whiskey, you can really taste those flavours that you might not be able to taste without it. So, one more sip of this one. Stony fruits and mellow honey at the finish there. And it has a beautiful, full-bodied, warm, smoky finish to it. It's rather lovely. So what do you think of this one? That's very interesting. So that is all of the 5 whiskies that we have for today. So is there a particular whiskey that you liked the most out of the 5? Or perhaps one you didn't like as much? Interesting. Well, thank you so much for visiting us and sampling our 5 featured whiskies. We will be sending out emails in the future to invite you to our future whiskey tasting sessions. Thank you very much for joining us today. Take care. Goodbye.